Be the Change با من بیتا میلانیان. قصه ما مهاجران.
با سلام و خوش آمد به 10مین برنامه Be the Change با من بیتا میلانیان از رادیو ایران 670 AM KIRN. امیدوارم همه دوستانی که امروز 25 ماه اکتبر سال 2020 از هر جای دنیا به این برنامه گوش بکنید تندرست و خوشحال باشید. قبل از شروع و معرفی میهمان عزیزی که واقعا باعث افتخار من هست که میزبان ایشون باشم، سپاس همیشگی دارم از تیم فنی و مدیریت رادیو ایران و همه زحماتشون برای تنظیم و پخش همه برنامه‌ها. امروز میزبان یک بانوی بسیار محترم، موفق و تاثیرگذار در جامعه هستم که من افتخار آشنایی با ایشون رو چندین سال هست که دارم و بسیاری از ایرانیان هم شاهد فعالیت‌های مهم ایشون به خصوص در مورد قوانین مهاجرتی آمریکا بوده و هستند. خانم افسانه اشلی تبدر یکی از جوانترین قاضی‌های زن ایرانی الاصل دادگاه مهاجرت آمریکا بودند زمانی که انتخاب شدند که امروز با ما در مورد قصه مهاجرت خودشون به آمریکا، فراز و نشیب‌های زندگیشون و چطور به این رتبه بسیار مهم و بالا دست یافتن صحبت خواهیم کرد. صحبت من امروز با ایشون به زبان انگلیسی خواهد بود. With that, I would like to introduce my very special guest today. Judge Tabaddor is the current president of the National Association of Immigration Judges. She was appointed to the bench as an immigration judge in November of 2005. She has presided over the detained, non-detained, juvenile, and mental competency dockets. Prior to her appointment, she served as an assistant U.S. attorney for the Central District of California in Los Angeles. She also served as a trial attorney with the Justice Department Civil Division in Washington, D.C., and as a law clerk and attorney advisor for the Immigration Court of the Chief Immigration Judge. She received her BA cum laude from UCLA and her law degree from UC Hastings College of the Law. In addition to her duties as a judge, Judge Tabaddor is an adjunct professor with the UCLA School of Law. She is the recipient of Judicial Excellence Awards by the Mexican American Bar Association, Armenian American Bar Association, the Arab American Lawyers Association of Southern California, and the Iranian American Bar Association. Judge Tabaddor is actively involved with the legal and the non-legal community, mentoring and speaking regularly before bar associations, conferences, symposiums, organizations, and schools. She's on the board of directors of the Federal Bar Association's Immigration Law section. She's an active member of the Pacific Council on International Policy and a member of the National Association of Women Judges. Judge Tabaddor is appearing on this program today in her capacity as the president of National Association of Immigration Judges and not as a representative of the Department of Justice. Wow, Your Honor, it is truly an honor to welcome you to Be the Change. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much, Bita John, for having me here. I so enjoy speaking with you and connecting with you, and please call me Ashley.
Oh, thank you so much. We've known each other for quite a while. It goes back to, I think we initially met back in, I want to say 2009 or so at the PAYA Passing the Torch of Success. Am I correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. I remember PAYA reaching out about passing the Torch of Success. I felt like, wait a minute, I just got here.
No, you were already so effective in your role already and such an inspiration, right away. And our community is so blessed to have individuals like you being exemplary. So, I just read your bio and I hope I did it justice reading it properly with all the different accolades and everything else that you've accomplished. So I apologize if I had any hiccups there, but I would love for you to take us down the journey of where it all began and you as an immigrant yourself to the U.S. and how it all got started, wherever you want to begin.
Sure. So I guess the story really begins Christmas Eve, 1982 is when our plane landed in JFK, New York. And we entered the United States after several months of trying to basically flee Iran. It was surprisingly a pretty difficult situation. Well, I shouldn't say surprisingly. It was very similar to what unfortunately a lot of people went through. Surprising in that it took a couple of years after the revolution for us to take that step. we had to flee through Pakistan, and we were abandoned by our smuggler. I was only about 10 or 11 when we left Iran, so I had a good sense of what's happening. I was certainly aware of the revolution. I was, I grew up in a family where there was very regular conversations about politics. So we were very sort of politically, socially conscious in Iran, and I always knew that there was a lot of discontent with a dictatorial monarchy in Iran. So the revolution initially, I could sense, at least within our circles, was welcome. But shortly thereafter, it was quite obvious that that was a colossal mistake, and our family began being targeted as well by the new regime, and we had to take steps. When we came, I was very young. I didn't speak a word of English. We moved quickly to California, where my aunt, my mother's sister, had been living with her family for a number of years. They had immigrated way before us. She was much more of a sort of progressive-minded person and active in getting to the U.S. Mm-hmm. But when we came here, it was a pretty steep learning curve. I had to learn the language, acculturate, so to speak, or assimilate. And there was definitely a lot of, I would say, self-hatred that goes on, or went on when we first entered. There was a lot of animosity towards the Iranian American community. It was shortly after the hostage situation. Right, I became aware of the impact of that on my cousins, who were males in schools, who oftentimes had to pretend that they were not Iranian. So the messaging was a lot about try to make yourself as quote unquote American as you can be. The great part, though, was that it really has turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to me. I feel extremely fortunate, though, that we did come to the United States, and I was given the opportunities that I've had. I was able to learn the language relatively quickly, and I came at a pretty good time because it gave me a few years before I graduated from high school. And so by the time I was out of high school, I had a pretty solid grasp of the language and solid grasp of sort of the community at large. So I think I became largely Americanized in that process. And that's where I was introduced to the American democratic and governmental systems. And that's where I was really inspired to follow in the civil rights and the law, and go with an eye towards going to law school when I was in high school. So as early as 11th grade and 12th grade, I could tell that this is really something that spoke very strongly to me, the desire to want to give back to the community, the desire to get involved with public service, and then do it in a legal capacity.
That's so wonderful to be able to have even as an young teenager, for you to really have an open mind in seeing everything that's happening around you, what's happened to you, to your family, to your community, and be inspired from those experiences to find your path in life. I mean, not too many people get to be that open-minded and that open to receive this kind of exchange in what's happening in your surroundings. Don't you agree? Sometimes we see younger generations kind of lost in their path and who they want to be when they grow up. So it's wonderful to have that. It's truly a blessing to be able to see that, to have those opportunities kind of make their way into your life.
Yeah, I think what I would say is that I was fortunate in a number of ways. One is that we were a politically, socially conscious family, so I was tuned into a lot of the problems that the government of Iran had, both sort of pre and post revolution. So I was already sort of charged up about it, and I was very conscious about it when we came here. And then you combined it with a pretty progressive family. Both my parents were very much in support of me becoming an independent person, independent thinker. So I never had some of the challenges that some of my friends had in terms of expectations or limitations that were placed on women or girls. Both my mother and father always encouraged me to follow my passions and be the best that I can be. And then I was in school and introduced to the American political and government system, the system of separation of powers, federalism, just studying the thinkers that really formulated the the balance of powers that we see as a design of the U.S. government. And I was absolutely blown away. I said, wow, coming from a background of so much corruption and ineptitude and incompetence and nepotism, and then looking at this and saying they had a very great insight about the human psyche and the importance of having checks and balances, as well as the importance of liberty and freedom.
Right.
So this felt very, very compelling to me. And yes, I was very lucky to have that clarity of thought and purpose that early on.
That's wonderful. Thanks for bringing that up, because I think it's so important many times for parents, especially immigrant parents tend to be so lost in their way of trying to figure it out. And they forget, they also need to be present for their children during these important decision-making times. I know my parents definitely didn't have any info. And I came here when I was 16. I turned 16 here. So shortly thereafter, I had to find my next decision of being, where to go to college. And they were trying to figure it out on their own, finding a new career path at age 45 and 50. And they had no idea what it means, for their young teen daughter to have to apply for college and, what all that meant. So, it's everybody has had their own version of these types of challenges as immigrant families. So it's wonderful that your parents early on, you also came a few years earlier, so they had maybe a chance to. Yeah.
For you had a tougher time, because that's why I look back and I realize, the system holds your hand a lot more when you're 10 or 11, right? So you're helped to navigate the educational system. The teachers are more involved. The schools are more involved. And so you learn the system better when you are younger. Whereas if you're coming at 16, that's a tough time. If you don't speak the language or if you don't know how to navigate the system, it's going to take you a lot longer. So I think you had a much tougher time.
It might, it's true. And, obviously getting involved with the PTAs and the school meetings and getting parents to connect with the teacher, which is something actually we didn't really have as much when I was growing up in Iran. There was no real connection between families and school systems. So, it's so important. And now today, luckily we have organizations like Parsi Equality Center and other, in other immigrant communities, there are nonprofits that are proactively educating and helping immigrant communities, which is, something we didn't have back then. So it's lovely to see this progress across the board, in support of, immigrant communities and people that just simply having access to information. I mean, let's also not discount the power of, internet and how much information you can capture in a finger, at a press of a finger. You can actually access information today, which we didn't have the privilege to back then. So you came to California with your family and got settled here. Were you in Los Angeles at the time?
Yes, we were in San Fernando Valley. We started out in Northridge and then eventually moved to Encino. From there, I went to UCLA as an undergrad, which was great. I remember initially, my parents painted my room, got me a car, which I was very excited about. I had, graduated well in my school, and this was sort of a reward. And I was going to drive. It's a 9-mile commute. Yeah. I drove for 2 weeks. That 9-mile commute is an hour and 20 minutes ride in the morning and an hour and a half ride in the afternoon. For those of you who don't know the traffic in Los Angeles.
Oh, yes.
After 2 weeks, I came back to my parents and I said, all right, we're having a family meeting. Sit down. I'm moving out.
Oh, that must have come across really well. The moving out of the kids of the immigrant families in the 80s and 90s were quite a story of all on its own. I've been there.
I had done my research. I went and found there was one student housing. There was a student who had gotten accepted into a sorority, and this was one of the hitch suites at UCLA, and she was looking for a substitute. And so it was the perfect timing. I had done my research. I found out the price. I had gotten some scholarship from my high school, so I had some extra money to use that I could use to at least pay for that first semester. And I sort of came to them as a fait accompli plan, like, okay, I'm moving. Here's the student place I'm going to take over. This is how much it's going to cost. I'm going to cover the first semester. You guys got to support me because this is a horrible experience. And as I said, I was lucky, I have a pretty progressive parent. I think my mother had, was more on my side, and she convinced my dad, and
Mm-hmm.
within short order, I signed up and moved, and I stayed at UCLA the whole time. I highly recommend it to kids to, if you can, and I know things have changed because the tuition has really skyrocketed, but I was lucky enough to have that on-campus experience, which I really recommend to students, because the educational experience isn't just about the books. It's about engaging in the
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree.
Yeah, right.
And having
that's the time when you learn.
Exactly. That's the time you get involved with the different clubs and groups and really learn the sense of, especially becoming part of community and society. I think it happens on college campuses.
Oh, and then just learning some of the basic logistical things like paying rent, doing how do you start the balancing act of making sure that the personal obligations and the day-to-day responsibilities are met while you're trying to complete your schoolwork, and then doing the extra work that's necessary for the next step, because I knew I was going to go to law school and it wasn't enough to just finish a bachelor's program.
Sure.
I had to be thinking about the next step.
Were there a lot of Iranian kids at the time, or how was your fellow immigrant experience during those years? Did you feel like you had already assimilated into the college life, or did you still feel like you were not fully part of it? Like, what was that like?
That's a good question. I mean, I think you alluded to how during our time of immigrating, there really wasn't a voice of Iranian American community the way that we have it now. I can certainly say that it wasn't until years later when I was in DC and we were creating the Iranian American Bar Association with a thought to starting to think about some sort of a collective voice, a mentorship program, some sort of a movement. So we didn't have that by any stretch of imagination. But I did have a fair amount of friends because I did go to local schools, so to speak. UCLA was within my community that I grew up. I did have some, and there was a lot of house parties in my high school year and college years. We don't see that these days.
Yeah,
I missed those, and a handful of those friends went to UCLA. So I definitely felt that I had a connection. But I also was striving very much to, I always had this feeling of internationalism, I think, in me. I had a very deep desire for travel, which I couldn't do at the time because we didn't, we got our green cards when I was in high school, but I didn't have a passport. The passports were confiscated by the Iranian government years before. There was always a fear of leaving the country and not being able to get back. But I always knew that I wanted to travel the world and just, I always had a great interest and continue to have a great interest in different cultures and different languages. So I tried. I don't know if that answers your question of how much I felt like
No, that's perfect. No, I totally can, relate to that. So that's great. So this was a great kickoff to this conversation. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back, and I would love for you to tell us more about your in-depth involvement in getting into the immigration law and what does that mean to you personally. We'll be right back, and we'll continue this wonderful conversation with Judge Tabaddor.
Be the change با من بیتا میلانیان. قصه ما مهاجران.
با سلام دوباره دوستان، من بیتا میلانیان هستم با برنامه بی د چنج. امروز با یک بانو بسیار عزیز و موفق در جامعه ایرانی، خانم قاضی اشلی تبدر صحبت میکنیم. اشلی جان، خوش آمدی دوباره به بی د چنج. Thank you so much for being here. We talked about your early years immigrating to the US and your high school and college years growing up in Los Angeles. Now you have graduated college and you've gotten your law degree. What happened and what happened next, and what was your first job out of college?
Sure. So my first job out of college was working with the immigration court as a law clerk. I knew very early on, as I mentioned, that I wanted to become a lawyer. I wanted to be in public service. I also knew that I wanted to be in court. My vision of a lawyer was always someone who was in court in a litigation setting. And so when I had the opportunity to clerk, which means to come in as the recent graduate with just your basic license, trying to get your bar license passed, you come in and work for judges. And I started working for the immigration judges as a law clerk, drafting decisions, researching issues for them. And the reason I really loved it, and this was sort of the best position for me, was it appealed to all my senses of what I was looking for. I've always felt it's very important to follow your passion, follow your purpose, that inner voice that tells you what makes you feel like you're doing something rewarding. For me, immigration had both a very, very intellectually challenging area of the law. So every day was trying to put together a puzzle. But it also spoke to sort of that emotional side. You know, I'm an immigrant myself. Our family had to navigate the immigration law system. We too were the victims of a lot of unscrupulous attorneys who took money, thousands of dollars, and made things worse. Ultimately, my dad was the one who really had to fix everything and get our paperwork for us. So I was very sensitive to the importance of being part of this system because I knew that what we did and the decisions that the judges issued had such a profound impact on people's lives. And that's why I came in as a law clerk and was always sort of involved with that type of decision making, which is I want to stay with the type of job that speaks to my desire to feel purposeful in it. And so it took a few years before I came back, did a full circle and came back on the bench as an immigration judge. But after being a judicial law clerk, I moved to Washington, D.C. to work for the chief immigration judge. For those who want to do anything under the federal sector, Washington, D.C. is where it's all happening. It's also when I stepped off the plane for the first time, and I had just moved there to start a new life as the attorney advisor for the chief immigration judge. It was the first time I really felt the history of the United States. It's an amazing city, with these unbelievable buildings and statues and memorials and Capitol. It really just moves you. It's unbelievable. And I felt, you asked that, do you feel like you fit in, at UCLA? I think I really felt like I fit in when I moved to DC and I was, walking to work, walking by these buildings, walking into these buildings, going into main justice buildings for meetings and actually partaking in conversations on changing some of the questions on some of these applications, coming up with some proposed regulations. It was unbelievably just.
I totally relate to the vibe of that city, Washington, D.C. And I remember a few years ago, I had a program that we were hosting in D.C. and I was there for at least 2 weeks. And so I got to really spend time around town and going into the different, obviously, sightseeing places, and especially Lincoln Memorial is, we did a night tour of the space, which is the time to go really. And I honestly, for the first time in 30 years or so at the time being in the US, I felt this powerful, this is what we all worked hard for. These are the people that made all these opportunities possible. It just was a very emotional, heavy in a good way moment, and really moment of appreciation for this country and all the things that it has offered to us, and the ability, the democracy and all those things. So, it made me even more thankful and grateful for all the hardship that my parents and the generations before us went through to create this. So I totally can relate to what you're saying in relation to being in the nation's capital.
Yes, I'm getting goosebumps as you were talking about the Lincoln Memorial and my time. I've been going back there. I'm now the president of our Association of Immigration Judges, and I go back and forth maybe prior to the pandemic on a pretty regular basis, and it just never gets old.
Yeah,
it really is. Every time you step into that space, you really realize what a historic place it is, and how much we owe a debt of gratitude to those before us and those who are here now. So DC and the whole system's amazing.
So you did all these great things. You worked hard, and let's fast forward to you being appointed the youngest at the time woman immigration judge of Iranian background. How did that all come about? And how does one become nominated and then elected and appointed, as a judge? I mean, that's something that I think many probably don't know, that process, how it happens and what qualifies you to even be nominated.
Sure. So I was in DC for a number of years, and I honestly felt like that was going to be the long-term residence for me. But then 9/11 hit, and 9/11 was a pretty big, it was just quite a tragedy. It really moved the nation in a ways that I think most people just didn't expect, obviously. So things were changing quite rapidly, and by 2002, I really felt this pull back to Los Angeles. I was doing a lot of traveling for work. I was appearing before circuit courts of appeal, a lot of times in California. And, in 2002, I just felt like it was time to come back. And so I was able to come back and work at the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is the litigation arm of the Department of Justice. Anytime the government of the United States gets sued, the U.S. Attorney's Office steps up. So this was an amazing opportunity, and it turned out to be in Los Angeles, and it was all post 9/11. So much was focused on immigration. I ended up having to take a lot of cases. Not every one of them was popular in my community. I was the target of some threats by our community members when I had to step up and defend some of the department and the government's regulatory action. But I always felt that it was important to make sure that you play by the rules and that you do the right thing. So through that, I was given the opportunity for an immigration judge position. I received a phone call from the Attorney General's office asking for my resume, asking if I had an interest in this. And the next thing I knew, I was flying back to DC for an interview for the position of an immigration judge. Wow. I think a lot of people don't appreciate, and this is the part I think, you hear me give this spiel a lot, but this is part of the president of NAIJ that I'm going to maybe take the prerogative to tell everybody about. Being an immigration judge is one of the most rewarding experiences of my life, because I know that what we do is life and death for many people. So I take it with the greatest responsibility that I can. But by the same token, it's the immigration court and the immigration judge system is one of those very unusual systems that are extremely problematic. Our immigration court system is within the Justice Department. Our immigration judges are appointed by the Attorney General, who's a law enforcement federal prosecutor. So it took me years to fully appreciate what happens when you have a court system that is in a law enforcement agency, when you have judges that are being hired and fired by a federal prosecutor. And no matter the depth of respect that I have and continue to have for the Justice Department and for our government, it took me back to my high school days when I was so blown away by that deep insight that our founding fathers had about human nature, the importance of having checks and balances, and why they created 3 separate and independent parts of the government, the judiciary separate from legislative, separate from the executive branch. And yet we find ourselves with the immigration court being part of the executive branch and being used as a law enforcement tool. So this is fast forwarding you very quickly to the current state of the challenges that we face and the amount of work that I've been doing with my role as the head of the union of all immigration judges across the country. We have about 500 immigration judges in the United States right now. We have 69 courts across the country. There's 1.3 million pending cases.
Wow.
And I mean, that's just, you can't even wrap your head around it. The number has doubled in the last 3 years.
Wow.
So every step that the law enforcement agency has taken in the name of sort of cutting down the backlog has increased the backlog. We have almost twice as many judges, and we have more than twice as many cases. So every one of every one of these dysfunctionalities goes back to that design defect, essentially, of having the court system and a law enforcement agency, and goes back to why our founding fathers were so insightful in separating out.
So if I may interject,
Sure.
so as your role or as the organization NAIJ, what is it that you guys are doing? What's your role around these issues? Can you address that? Yeah.
So immigration, as you know, is a very, very hotly sort of debated, very politicized area of the law in the United States. Immigration court comes into the play for the individuals that the government of the United States wants to remove. So those people that the government says, okay, we found you, we've identified you, we want you deported from the United States. Those individuals have a right to come before the immigration court and to have their cases heard by immigration judges. The problem is that the court and the judges are also run by the Attorney General. So you find yourself in a situation where you're between a rock and a hard place. You're part of a court system that is being administered by individuals and an agency that is not tasked with running a court. So the judicial branch, a traditional court, like say state court or the district court, when you go there, the people who are hired to administer the court are experts in running a court. The judges are put in there and given job protection so that they can make decisions without worrying about losing their job. The immigration court doesn't have that. The people who are being selected to run the court are selected for their political ideology and political connections. So what happens is that the people at the top are put in there through the executive branch. And they're part of each administration. With each change of administration, all the priorities change for the court. And so that makes it very difficult for the judges to have the support they need to run a court. So, because judges don't act like an island. It's not like if I just go to court and I do everything, right?
Right.
I need support staff. We need law clerks, file clerks. There are parties who are coming before the court. There's a whole apparatus that needs to support the court. But if the people who are supposed to support that are not really focused on that, but they're more focused about how to structure the court consistent with law enforcement agencies, politics or priorities, this is when you run into problems. And this is why we run. So that's what our organization does. I'm sorry for...
No. That's very insightful, and it's so important for, a lot of times we complain about immigration policies or things that are happening around immigration or for generally speaking, the any area of the law where it impacts us and we become vocal about it. And I personally became more vocal about where I stand, politically because of immigration laws that have changed. So I think it's so important for us to really spend time, if we're passionate about something that's, important to us, to really do the research and understand the different entities and the cause of issues and the root of the problems and why they happen the way they happen and who's fighting it and trying to change and make it right again. So it's really, for me personally, even though I thought I know a lot about you, now I'm even more grateful for people like you who are really, going above and beyond, not just, in the role as a judge, but also as an individual in society and really being the change makers. And that's what the premise of this show is all about, that we each are given opportunities and presented chances to become who we become as a significant member of community. But how do we take that opportunity and really take it to the next level and be a, even more effective member of society? And obviously you, Ashley John, you've been at the realm of that, and you've not only been active in the immigration arena and the law, but you also are so always amazingly supportive of different entities and nonprofits. As we mentioned early on the program, we met each other at Paya's second passing of the Torch of Success, where you were one of the speakers inspiring the young Iranian Americans back then. And since then, I know you've been also involved with a lot of different nonprofits, including, the Los Angeles Beirut Sister Cities group, where you kindly introduced me to them back in 2017 and got me in trouble into dancing and competing. And, that was one of the best experiences.
Great. You were the best. I still get thank yous from my friend Camille. It's like,
we had so much fun, and that was another, that was for me personally through you. I got to get, learn about another great immigrant community, an Iranian, went and supported the Lebanese organization and raised the most amount of money. Hey, represent the Iranian Americans. But, joking aside, I think sometimes, again, this is another great example that we should not just stay in our own bubble of our own little, our community or whatever, whatever we do. I think we need to diversify and be inclusive. We're all one as human beings, and it's so important to support one another and not just be kind of stuck in this one arena, whatever it is that we're doing, and just explore the world and people, and it's just such an eye-opening and heartwarming place to be when you get to know other people's way of life and you learn from them and, their cultures and their mindset, even if we don't agree with them, which is, I think, even more important when you don't agree with them to really get to know them, because that's when you really learn. Don't you think?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think I call it the unexamined assumption.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is we go through life doing a lot of things just without even thinking, under the assumption, this is how it's done, or this is how you should approach it. And unless you actually expose yourself to people who think differently and do things differently, do you then begin to realize that, oh, wait, I didn't realize that I could do this differently. I didn't realize that there was this one other option or these other options of doing it. And wow, what a difference it makes. And so for me, it's been an amazing personal journey to try to do that, to try to expose myself to as many different cultures and ways of life and thought processes in an effort to frankly just allow myself to grow as much as possible. I think that's part of the self-actualization, is that how do I know what my potential is if I don't even know what's out there, if I don't even know what things I'm taking for granted.
Absolutely.
So I agree with you that it's really important to sort of be always open to seeing things from a different angle, from a different perspective. And particularly one of the ways a friend of mine mentioned it, and she said, anytime you feel extremely passionate about something, that this is just 150% right, that's when you should probably pause.
Yeah.
And think about how much of your position is driven by emotion and how much of it is really this desire to want to hold on to just your way of thinking, doing things, rather than being open to other ways as well.
I think that's a great note to wrap up this conversation that I could have with you for hours. Is we're in a place in society today globally, with the pandemic, with the elections ahead, that we're all have become so much more sensitive, and I myself included. I think I can speak for many of my friends around me that we talk about this issue a lot. And it's so much more crucial, more than ever, for us to become, more conscious about each other's feelings and not just our own, and how those feelings and emotions impact our actions in society, and how we really need to become even more united and be there for each other, because I think we're all vulnerable more than ever before. And I think this impacts also on the decisions that we make for ourselves every day. So I thank you so much, Ashley June, Judge Tabaddor, for taking the time to share with us, give us a glimpse of your journey, which has, we obviously couldn't go into more depth, but it's definitely been rewarding for you and all the hard work you've done. Kudos to your parents and your family for supporting you and everyone else. Any final thoughts, any tips you can give to future lawyers who aspire to become a judge or go beyond that you would give?
Sure. Well, first of all, I have to say thank you, Bita Jan, for having me today. If somebody needs to do the reverse the table and do the interview of you, because you have so much to give, and I've seen you just expand and grow over the past several years. I love watching your little cooking stuff and the community involvement, and you're always yes attitude. So I think that's definitely wonderful to watch, and one thing I would certainly
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Is to do that. It's really amazing. But on that note, in terms of for people who are interested, it took me a long time to really appreciate the wisdom of two thoughts. One is the wisdom of sincere networking, which is something that in Iran it was always considered partybazi, and I hated that, so I never did it. But here I learned that it's not partybazi. It really is about networking, connecting, and that's a very key part of anyone's success. And the second part is about finding good mentors. That's the other thing that we never really were taught as children. You were just kind of expected to navigate on your own or figure it out on your own. But I think some of the most successful people are those who look out and reach out to mentors and find those who have accomplished, who are farther along the path, and ask for their help. So don't be afraid to ask for help of those people that you think would be mentors. And I'm always happy to try to help the best I can, for the younger generation or anybody else. And that's the little sort of advice that I would give for the younger ones who are looking for that.
Beautiful. Power of networking. I think it's crucial, and there's so many ways to do it these days with technology and the different associations and organizations. So I myself, if I ever am asked the same question, that's my top answer. And networking is power. So thank you again, Ashley Judge. I hope to see you soon in person. It's been a long time, but I wish you well, more power, and I cannot wait to watch and see what you will accomplish next. I'm sure there's many more things ahead for you, and thank you again so much.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thank you everyone. با سپاس دوباره از همگی که امروز با ما بودید. امیدوارم که از برنامه امروز همونقدری که من لذت برده باشین. لطفاً پیغاماتون رو برای من بفرستین. ایده هایی که دارین، اگه هر سوالی چیزی هست حتما با من در تماس باشین. امیدوارم که در برنامه‌های آینده باز هم با شما باشم. روز شب همگی خوش.